When we are wronged, our first instinct is to demand justice, swift, immediate, and visible. The wound burns, the injustice lingers, and the mind clings to the offense as if nursing it will restore what was lost. And yet, we find ourselves confronted with an inconvenient truth. God's justice does not operate on our timetable, nor does it resemble the justice we so often crave. God, who sees all, does not overlook wrongdoing. The hands that wound, the tongues that slander, and the hearts that plot destruction are not hidden from his sight. But what does he do with them? Does he strike them down in the very moment of their cruelty? No. He does something far more profound. He either leads them to repentance or lets them walk toward the judgment they have chosen. And what of us, the wounded? Do we remain helpless victims, waiting for our offenders to fall? No, for we are called to something higher. It is in the furnace of suffering that we are refined, in the shadows of betrayal that we learn true dependence on God. The pain meant to break us can instead become the very thing that strengthens our spirit, deepens our character, and sharpens our wisdom. But here lies the greatest challenge. God calls us to forgive, not because he ignores evil, but because he refuses to let evil shape us. Forgiveness is not an act of weakness. It is the ultimate declaration of freedom. It is not a denial of justice, but a surrender of justice into the hands of the one who alone can execute it perfectly. So let them scheme, let them wound, let them think they have triumphed. The story is not over. God is not indifferent, nor is he absent. His justice is sure, his timing perfect, and his purpose for you remains untouched by the hands of your enemies. The question is not whether he will deal with those who hurt you. He will. The question is whether you will allow him to deal with your heart in the process. When we are wronged, our natural response is to seek justice, immediate, tangible, and in proportion to the harm we have suffered. The human heart cries out for fairness, for balance, for some kind of retribution that will make things right again. And yet, when we turn to God, we find a justice that is higher than our own, a way of dealing with wrongdoing that often confounds our expectations. God does not ignore injustice. Every act of cruelty, every deception, every betrayal is seen and accounted for. The hands that harm others, the lips that speak falsehoods, the minds that devise evil schemes do not escape his notice. But his response to these offenses is not always swift, nor does it always align with the justice we imagine. We might hope for immediate consequences, a sign, a punishment, a visible proof that wrongdoing does not go unpunished. Instead, we often see the wicked prosper, the guilty escape, and the innocent suffer. This apparent delay, however, is not evidence of God's indifference. It is evidence of his patience. God's justice is not a reaction, it is a process. He does not operate on the same timeline as we do, nor does he limit himself to the narrow scope of human retaliation. We may want those who hurt us to feel the same pain they inflicted, but God desires something far greater, transformation. His justice is not just about punishing evil, but about redeeming those who commit it, when possible. Consider how often he extends grace, not only to the victims but also to the offenders, offering them opportunities to repent, to turn away from their wrongdoing, to choose a different path. This is a hard truth to accept. It means that sometimes those who have wounded us will be given time to change, and in that time they may continue living as though nothing has happened. We might see them thriving, succeeding, even enjoying life, while we carry the scars of what they have done. But God is never deceived. He is never mocked. No injustice will be left unaddressed. No cruelty will be overlooked. The delay of consequences is not their escape, it is their test. If they turn from their ways, they receive mercy, just as we ourselves have received mercy for our own wrongs. But if they persist, they are only storing up judgment for themselves, judgment that will come at its appointed time. God's justice is not merely about what happens to the wrongdoer, it is also about what happens within us. When we entrust our pain to God, we are freed from the burden of seeking vengeance, the weight of resentment, the consuming fire of bitterness, the exhausting pursuit of payback. None of these are ours to carry. We are not meant to be the judges of the world. We are meant to be those who walk in faith, trusting that the one who sees all will act in righteousness. Revenge may seem satisfying in the moment, but it does not heal, it does not restore, it does not bring peace. The justice of God, on the other hand, accomplishes all these things. It ensures that every wrong is accounted for, that every wound is acknowledged, that every tear is seen, and in the end, it reminds us that our greatest hope is not in seeing our enemies fall, but in knowing that we are held securely by the one who will never fail to do what is right. To trust God's justice is to release our need to control the outcome. It is to believe that no one gets away with anything in the long run, and that in His wisdom He knows exactly when and how to act. Sometimes He will bring justice in this life, revealing the truth and exposing wrongdoing. Other times, justice will come in ways we cannot immediately see, unfolding in His perfect time, and in the end there will be a final reckoning, where every hidden thing will be brought to light, and every deed will be judged in the sight of absolute truth. Until then we wait, not in despair, but in confidence, not in frustration, but in trust. For we know that the God who is sovereign over all things is neither blind nor silent. He is simply working in ways far greater than we can imagine. Suffering is one of the greatest mysteries of human existence. When we are wronged, betrayed, or hurt, our immediate question is often, why? Why would God allow such pain? Why does He not intervene sooner? Why must we endure wounds caused by others? These questions press heavily on the heart, and yet when we turn to God's perspective, we find that suffering is never without purpose. Pain, when surrendered to God, becomes more than just an unfortunate event. It becomes a tool in His hands. It is through trials that we are refined, through affliction that we are strengthened, and through wounds that we learn the depth of God's healing power. What was meant to break us can instead become the very thing that builds us. But this transformation does not happen automatically. It requires a decision on our part. We can allow suffering to make us bitter, or we can allow it to make us better. God does not waste suffering. Every tear, every heartache, every disappointment serves a greater purpose when placed in His hands. The wounds inflicted by others often expose the deepest places within us that still need healing. They reveal where we have placed our trust, where our weaknesses lie, and where our faith has not yet been fully surrendered. If we let Him, God will use these moments to strengthen our character, deepen our dependence on Him, and teach us resilience. Consider how fire refines gold. The raw metal is placed in intense heat, causing impurities to rise to the surface so they can be removed. Without the fire, the gold remains mixed with elements that lessen its value. In the same way, trials reveal the impurities in our hearts. Pride, self-reliance, resentment, fear, and offer us the opportunity to let God purify us. The very pain that seemed unbearable at first becomes the instrument that shapes us into something stronger, something purer, something unshakable. This is not to say that suffering is easy or that injustice should be dismissed. It is natural to grieve, to feel anger, to desire justice. But there is a difference between acknowledging pain and allowing it to define us. If we hold on to bitterness, we remain prisoners of the very people who hurt us. If we surrender our pain to God, we allow Him to work through it, to transform it, to turn it into something that strengthens rather than weakens us. Often, the greatest growth happens not in seasons of comfort, but in seasons of hardship. It is when we are betrayed that we learn the depth of God's faithfulness. It is when we are abandoned that we discover He never leaves us. It is when we are broken that we come to know Him as the great restorer. The trials that seem like setbacks are often the very things that prepare us for what lies ahead. Many of the strongest, most compassionate, and most faith-filled people are those who have walked through suffering and allowed it to shape them rather than destroy them. God does not take pleasure in our pain, nor does He cause evil. But He does use everything for good, even the things meant for our harm. When Joseph was betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery and wrongfully imprisoned, it would have been easy for him to become bitter. Yet, in the end, he was able to say, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good." This is the essence of how God works, turning what was meant to break us into something that blesses not only us, but others as well. The key is trust. Do we believe that God is working, even when we do not see it? Do we believe that He can take the worst moments of our lives and use them for a greater purpose? If we do, then suffering is no longer just suffering. It becomes a pathway to growth, to wisdom, and to a deeper relationship with the One who holds all things in His hands. And in the end, we find that the pain we thought would destroy us has instead shaped us into who we were meant to be. Forgiveness is one of the hardest commands given to us, yet it is also one of the most powerful. When someone wounds us, the natural response is to hold on to the pain, to seek justice, or to wait for an apology that may never come. We convince ourselves that forgiveness is letting the other person off the hook, that it is an act of weakness, a surrender in the face of injustice. But in reality, forgiveness is not about excusing wrongdoing or pretending that pain does not exist. It is about breaking free from the control that the offense has over us. It is about releasing ourselves from the burden of resentment and choosing to walk in the freedom that God has called us to. When we refuse to forgive, we chain ourselves to the very people who hurt us. Our thoughts become consumed with what they did. Our emotions are dictated by past wounds, and our hearts grow heavy with bitterness. It may feel like holding on to the pain gives us some kind of power, but in truth, it robs us of peace. Unforgiveness does not imprison our offenders, it imprisons us. It allows the past to dictate our future and keeps us stuck in a cycle of hurt. God calls us to forgive not because He ignores injustice, but because He knows that forgiveness is the only way we can truly be free. He does not ask us to pretend that the pain is insignificant or that the wrong done to us does not matter. Instead, He asks us to trust Him with justice. When we forgive, we are not saying that what happened was acceptable. We are saying that we refuse to let it define us. We are handing the situation over to the One who sees all and judges rightly. Forgiveness is not an emotion. It is a decision. If we wait until we feel like forgiving, we may never do it. But when we choose to forgive, whether or not the other person deserves it, we open ourselves to healing. The process may take time. There may be moments when the hurt resurfaces, and we are tempted to hold on to it again. But forgiveness is not a one-time act. It is a journey. It is a continuous choice to release bitterness, to pray for those who have wronged us, and to allow God to mend what has been broken. It is also important to understand that forgiveness does not mean continued access Just because we forgive someone does not mean we must allow them to hurt us again. Forgiveness and reconciliation are not the same. We can forgive and still set boundaries. We can release resentment without putting ourselves back in harm's way. God calls us to love, but love does not mean enabling toxic behavior. It means seeking peace, even if that peace requires distance. Perhaps the greatest example of forgiveness is Christ himself. On the cross, in the midst of unimaginable suffering, he looked at those who mocked, beat, and crucified him and said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." If there was ever a moment where vengeance would have been justified, it was that one. Yet he chose mercy. He chose to forgive, not because they deserved it, but because he was operating from a higher truth. If we are to follow God's ways, we must adopt this same perspective. We forgive because we have been forgiven. We release others because God has released us. When we grasp the depth of our own need for grace, it becomes easier to extend it to others. It does not mean the pain instantly disappears. It does not mean justice will not come. But it does mean we trust God to handle it in His way, in His time. And when we do, we find something unexpected: peace. The weight that we thought we had to carry is lifted. The control that the past had over us is broken. And we step into the life God has called us to, unhindered, unburdened, and free.